account I want to look at is the genealogy of Jesus, which involves, once more, what I would call a set of not just medieval but modern legends. This is a very interesting piece from the exhibit. It's from the Gladzor Gospels, which is a Armenian gospel text. So the writing that you see here is Armenian. It's from the 14th century. This is an account of Jesus, of the genealogy of Jesus. So who begat whom, begat whom, begat whom. My students think the genealogies are the most boring part of the Bible. But you know, when they're taking the New Testament class, I have no sympathy for them at all. You know, I tell them, look, Matthew's genealogy is 16 verses long. It's just 16 verses long. If you want a genealogy, go to 1 Chronicles. 9 chapters of who begat whom. So and the genealogies in the New Testament, Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke are the two Gospels in the New Testament that give genealogies. And they're very interesting genealogies because they actually say you actually can get a lot of very interesting information. Well, this is a genealogy where you have not just who the ancestors of Jesus were, but also you have artistic representations of these people. And in another page of the same manuscript that's on the exhibit, it goes down. They're showing the page that goes down to Mary, and so there's a presentation of Jesus' immediate lineage on one of the other pages. Let me say a few things about the genealogy of Jesus as another kind of legend. This time, a legend that is in the New Testament. The Gospel accounts. The Gospel of Mark does not have a genealogy, probably because it does not have an account of Jesus' birth. Mark's Gospel begins with Jesus as an adult. The same is true with the Gospel of John. It begins with Jesus as an adult. Matthew and Luke, however, are the two Gospels in the New Testament that tell stories about Jesus being born. And so, in both Matthew and Luke, in addition to birth narratives, you also are given genealogies in which you have the family line of Jesus traced back to his remote ancestors. Just a second, I don't want to get the historical reality yet. The interesting thing about the genealogies of Matthew and Luke, there are several interesting things. The most interesting thing to many modern readers is that the two genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke are different genealogies. They're different. They're different in a lot of ways. Some of the ways don't matter and some do matter. One way that may not matter is that Matthew's genealogy is set up to show that Jesus descended from King David and he descended from Abraham. And so the genealogy begins, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Well, who's that? Okay, so David is the greatest king in Jewish history, and it was understood that his descendant would be the future Messiah. And so by saying that Jesus is the son of David, Matthew is indicating that he's the Messiah. But he's also called the son of Abraham. Why Abraham? Because Abraham is the father of the Jews. The Jews trace their lineage back to Abraham. And so, Jesus' genealogy is traced back to Abraham. As many of you know, Matthew's gospel is often thought to be the most Jewish of the gospels, and so it traces Jesus' Jewish lineage. Luke's genealogy, in some ways, is even more interesting because it does trace Jesus back to David and back to Abraham, but that's not the emphasis. Jesus' genealogy in Luke's gospel is traced back to Adam, as in Adam and Eve. That's a great genealogy. I have an aunt who's a genealogist who is very proud about the fact that she's traced my family line back to the Mayflower. The Mayflower? Adam and Eve. Serious genealogy. The logic of Adam's genealogy, of Luke's genealogy, is that unlike Matthew wants to show that Jesus is the Savior to the Jews, the Jewish Messiah, Luke wants to emphasize that Jesus is the Savior of all people, Jews and Gentiles. And so his line is traced back to the first human, to Adam himself. So that's a difference, but it's not a discrepancy or a contradiction. It's just a difference. The discrepancy is that the family line of Jesus is traced back through Joseph to David in different lines. Now, let me make a couple points about that. First, the genealogies are both genealogies of Joseph. That should strike you as very strange, because both Matthew and Luke insist that Jesus was born of a virgin. Joseph was not his father. But the genealogy is the genealogy of Joseph. But Jesus doesn't belong to that family line. Well, the Gospels don't give us an answer to that one. I think you have to assume that he was adopted by Joseph, and so he was sort of adopted into the line, but he's not part of the bloodline, which is the point of a genealogy. Neither of the Gospels trace the line of Mary. They're both tracing Joseph. But what is even more interesting is that they're different genealogies of Joseph. If you look carefully, you don't have to look too carefully, just read what it says. Ask yourself, who is Joseph's father? It depends whether you're reading Matthew or Luke. Who's his grandfather? Different names. Great-grandfather? Different names. Different names all the way from Joseph back to King David. In Matthew's genealogy, Joseph descends from David's son Solomon. In Luke's genealogy, he descends from David's son Nathan. Different. Well, how can that be? Well, it can't be, literally. What's going on here is that both of these authors want to trace the genealogy of Jesus, and the reality is they don't know. I mean, how would they know? People have this mistaken notion that in the ancient world, everybody kept detailed records of these things. People did not keep detailed records of these things. And so Matthew and Luke have had to do the best they could to come up with genealogies of Jesus for purposes of their own. The historical reality is we don't know who Joseph's father or grandfather or great-grandfather was. It's something we simply can't know. I should add, one of the interesting things about Matthew's genealogy is that it is clearly a constructed genealogy. Matthew goes through the genealogy from Abraham to David, and then he goes from David to the biggest disaster in the history of ancient Israel when they were destroyed by the Babylonians for the Babylonian exile that happened in the 6th century. And then he goes from the Babylonian exile down to Jesus. He divides it into thirds. And what he tells you, and it's when you add it up, he points out that there were 14 generations between Abraham and David, 14 generations between David and the Babylonian exile, and 14 generations between the Babylonian exile and the Messiah, Jesus. 14, 14, 14. It's almost as if something miraculous is happening every 14 generations in the history of Israel. So that this birth of Jesus, in fact, is almost like it's fulfilling a prophecy or something. It's part of the divine plan. The problem with that is that, well, there's several problems. One problem is that when you actually add up the numbers, the third set of 14 is actually only 13. He counted wrong. So that's a problem. The other problem is that you can compare the genealogy that Matthew gives you with the genealogy that he got it from the Old Testament, and he left out a few names in a few places. Why? Because he wanted the number 14. So it would be 14, 14, 14, so it would look like a miracle. It not only looked like a miracle, there are several theories about this 14 thing. You know, ancient peoples really like numbers. Well, what is 14? Well, it's twice 7. 7 is the perfect number. This is a doubly perfect genealogy. The other interesting thing is that when you spell, okay, this is a little complicated. So, in ancient languages, they didn't use a different alphabetic system from their numerical system the way we do, right? We use Roman letters, but we use Arabic numerals. In ancient languages, they used the letters of the alphabet for their numbers. And so, for example, in Hebrew, Aleph, the first letter is worth 1, Beth is worth 2, Gimel is worth 3, and so on. And so every letter has a numerical value. If you spell the name David in Hebrew and add it up, remember the Messiah is to be the son of David? Spell David in Hebrew and add the letters up, 14, as it turns out. And so the 14, 14, 14 thing in Matthew may be a way of saying this really is the son of David. My point, though, is that it's a constructed genealogy. In other words, it's not something that you can go to the bank on as being historically accurate. It's not historically accurate. People wanted to say that Jesus had certain kinds of lineages, certain genealogical lineage, and they had to make up genealogies in order to pull it off, including the genealogies that ended up making it into the New Testament of Matthew and Luke. And so another picture of Jesus' relatives, his ancestors. Finally, this will be my last point about legends involving the New Testament. The authors of the New Testament Gospels themselves. There are several very nice portrayals of the Gospel writers in the exhibit. This is Matthew. You can see he is busy writing his Gospel. Since this comes from a 17th century Bible, so it's an early modern Bible with its portrayal of Matthew, who is seated on a kind of a throne-like thing, but he's writing, since this thing was done in the 17th century, he's not writing in a scroll the way ancient people tended to write. He's writing in a book. This is Mark, who has a little book desk on which he can write his gospel, and so far he's written one word, the word arche, the beginning. He's got a ways to go yet. And this is Luke, who has a kind of a little writing table that he is using with a stylus in his hand. And so this is both. The Mark was from a 13th century gospel manuscript. This portrayal of Luke is from a 12th century gospel manuscript. Traditionally, of course, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were thought to be the authors of the first three Gospels. John thought to be the author of the fourth Gospel. These are traditional descriptions. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Bibles that you read today have the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the titles, the Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to Mark, etc. You will notice, however, that when you actually read the Gospels, the authors don't identify themselves. The Gospels of the New Testament, in fact, are all anonymous. The authors don't identify themselves. Whoever put the titles in the Gospel, over the Gospels, were later editors. They were not in the original writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were added by editors who wanted you to know who it was who actually wrote these things. The traditional descriptions indicate that two of the writers of the Gospels were actually disciples of Jesus. Matthew, the tax collector mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, and John, the beloved disciple of the Gospel of John. And so those two were disciples. Mark was thought to be the secretary for the Apostle Peter. So Mark was the secretary for Peter, who wrote down what Peter said and then organized it into a gospel. Luke, I'm not saying how it really was, I'm telling you what the tradition says. Luke was thought to have been the traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. Now Luke wasn't one of the disciples, and Paul actually wasn't one of the disciples either, but Luke did his homework, and he was an associate of the Apostle Paul, and so he also wrote a gospel. And so that's how you get Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, two disciples and two companions of the apostles. What we actually know about these authors. So, it seems unlikely to many critical scholars of the Bible today that these books were actually written by disciples of Jesus, that the two disciples were the writers and that Mark was a writer of the... In fact, it's unlikely that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were actually written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It is pretty clear that the Gospels of the New Testament are not eyewitness reports of what happened in the life of Jesus. These Gospels were not written by the immediate followers of Jesus. One reason for thinking that is because it is almost certain that the immediate followers of Jesus could not write. Today, we're used to everybody, basically everybody, 99% of this country is at some level literate. Not everybody. Literacy is still it's a big problem. Illiteracy is still a big problem. But just about 99% of people can read something and can sign their names. In the ancient world, it wasn't like that. Massive literacy didn't come about until the Industrial Revolution. In ancient cultures, in fact, most people could not read or write, and far more people could read than could write. There have been estimates about literacy in the ancient world, the most famous of which was made by a scholar at Columbia University named William Harris, who wrote a book called Ancient Literacy. Harris estimates that in the ancient world, at the best of times, maybe 10% of the population could read and write. And by write, he means be able to copy out somebody else's writing. Far fewer than that 10% could compose a sentence. Fewer than that could compose a narrative. Far fewer people could compose an entire book. Who were the people who could compose books? The people who were highly literate were the people who were very wealthy. They came from very wealthy families. They were almost always in urban settings, who had the leisure and the finances to get a high-level education. That's who could write in the ancient world. There have been studies of literacy in ancient Palestine, where Jesus ministered. These estimates indicate that because Palestine was far more rural than many other places in the Roman Empire, there were lower literacy rates. Contrary to what many people think, which is many people think that every Jewish boy went to synagogue school and learned how to read and write, that appears to be a modern myth. In fact, ancient literacy in Palestine was very low. The best estimates indicate that probably at the time of Jesus, maybe 3% of the population was roughly literate. Far fewer than that could write, especially write books. The other thing to point out is that Jesus' native language and the native language of his followers was Aramaic. They spoke Aramaic. The reason that matters is because of what I said at the very beginning. The New Testament Gospels were written in Greek. They not only survive in Greek, they were originally written in Greek. And not just kind of low-level Greek, they're actually pretty good Greek. Whoever wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were highly educated, Greek-speaking Christians. These books are normally dated 30, 40, or 50 years after Jesus' death, probably some years after the death of his apostles. I think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by followers of Jesus or companions of his apostles. They were probably written by unknown persons who decided to write anonymously, and since they wrote anonymously, we don't know their names. But the traditional ascriptions are probably not right. Probably they were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's a legend. It's a legend that in some sense is rooted in the Bible itself because, of course, in our Bibles today we read the Gospel according to Matthew, but we don't know actually who the author was, other than he was a later Christian who was highly educated and was not an Aramaic speaker but a Greek speaker. Still, the tradition goes back to the 2nd century. Within 100 years of the production of these books, after they had been circulating anonymously for about 100 years, there are church fathers who say that their names were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they give some of the indications, some of the traditional legends about them already in the 2nd Christian century. By the way, one other piece of evidence that, for example, that Matthew did not write Matthew, apart from the fact that Matthew was an Aramaic-speaking lower-class person from Palestine who probably was illiterate, when you read the Gospel of Matthew, there's the calling of Matthew in Matthew chapter 9, where Matthew is called to be a disciple. And it's not narrated in the first person. In other words, the author doesn't say, one day Jesus came up to my tax collecting booth and he said to me, he doesn't narrate it, he narrates it in the third person. Why is it narrated in the third person? Because he's talking about somebody else. It's only later people who said, oh yeah, the person who wrote this thing is Matthew. Let me wrap this up with just a few conclusions, and then I will be happy to entertain any questions. This artwork is compelling on its own terms. This exhibit here in the Getty provides superb examples of medieval illuminated manuscripts that is interesting in artistic terms. It is also interesting because of what it tells us about what people were thinking through the Middle Ages, at least the artists who were producing this work, who I think in many ways were thinking about the stories of Jesus the way other medieval people were thinking who were not artistically gifted. The stories of Jesus were important because they told spiritual truths. It did not matter to these people that this actually happened or this actually didn't happen. They didn't think in those historiographic terms. There were stories being told about Jesus that were valuable as stories because the stories themselves conveyed spiritual truths. It did not matter to these people whether these stories were really in the Bible or not. They didn't have a clear sense of which books are in and which are out. You know, the educated people could have told you, but uneducated people, in other words, the vast majority of people in the medieval period and the early modern period, probably could not tell you which books are really in the New Testament. They had heard stories about Jesus, and the stories they heard were valuable in and of themselves, whether they were in the Bible or not. The stories were not necessarily to be taken literally and to be taken apart word for word in a kind of careful exegesis of the passages. The stories conveyed spiritual truth that you could talk about. You could talk about these stories and learn from them. The art helped people think about these stories. They helped them reflect on these stories, and they helped them see the spiritual truths that they found in these stories. Thank you very much. I think there are 2 microphones that are available. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and we will try to get a microphone to you.
Hi, Mike McNamara. Is the New Testament clear on whether or not God and Mary were the parents of Jesus? Or is sometimes Jesus thought of as the new Adam, and he's placed, I guess, in Mary's womb, and then Adam comes out, but Mary didn't really have anything to do with it other than carrying the child. Is the New Testament clear on that, or is it contradictory on that?
Are you asking whether the New Testament intimates that God performed a kind of sexual act with Mary?
No, but is Mary... Does she furnish some of the what we call genes of Jesus?
Yeah, right.
Or is Jesus really a new man, a new Adam?
Yes, right. Yeah. So the New Testament is not clear on this, and unfortunately, again, there's not the artwork to help us out on it. But what the New Testament There are only 2 passages that really talk about Mary giving birth. There's the passage in Matthew and the passage in Luke. Matthew says nothing. All it says is the birth of Jesus was like this, and then Jesus gets born. So there's nothing. In Luke, however, there's the account of the Annunciation. And there's a very nice picture, a nice artistic representation of the Annunciation in the exhibit here, where the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and tells her that she's going to conceive, and she becomes a little bit confused because she's never had sex, and so how is she going to conceive? And Gabriel tells her how. And this is Luke chapter 1, verse 35. The angel Gabriel tells her, "The Holy Spirit shall come upon you, the power of the Most High shall overshadow you, so that the one born of you shall be called Holy, the Son of God." Now, it looks like what he's saying is that the Spirit is going to make her pregnant. And it's using fairly graphic physical language. And so it's a little bit hard to know if that's what it means, but that may be what it means. How much of Mary sort of was conveyed into Jesus? There were later heresies in the 2nd century that said that Mary gave nothing to Jesus, that he came through her like water through a tube, where the water doesn't pick up anything from the tube, it's just the conduit. So Mary was just the conduit. But that view was later declared heresy, because Mary did pass on a human nature to Jesus, even though she did not pass along a sinful nature to Jesus. But that's a later thing. The New Testament. So what I could have done in answering your question is, you asked, does the New Testament say anything about it? My answer could have been no. You're welcome.
Hi, this is maybe a little bit off topic, but I've seen portrayals of Jesus as Sol Invictus in Roman mosaics. Are you aware of any portrayal of Jesus in the Docetic tradition?
Any portrayals of Jesus? So you're not asking about Sol Invictus, you're asking about the
Yeah,
Docetic tradition?
Just how some of the heretical views
Yes, right.
survived in art.
Yeah, no, I don't know anything about that. Right. How would you portray a docetic Jesus? I guess maybe a blank page, right? He wouldn't be there. So I don't know.
What does that word mean?
Yeah, Salvador Dali's Last Supper. Okay, yeah, sorry, we're doing inside talk. Right. So, right. When he's referring to a docetic view of Jesus, in the early church, there were debates about, who is Jesus? I mean, is he a human? If he's human, is he also God? If he's God, how can he be human? And there were all sorts of variations about different people had different opinions. There were some people who said Jesus is a full flesh and blood human being. His parents were Mary and Joseph. They had sex. They had a baby. His name was Jesus. He was more righteous than anyone else, and he was chosen by God to be the Savior of the world. So he was a human. But if he's a human, he's not God, because there's only one God. And if Jesus is God and God is God, you've got two gods. So that you don't have two gods, you got one God. And so there were people who said Jesus is human, but he's not God. There were other people who said Jesus is God, but he's not human. If he's God, he can't be human. I mean, a human can't be God any more than a human can be a grape. I mean, they're different things. And so if you're God, you're not human. If you're human, you're not God. Well, then, if Jesus is God, why did he seem to be human? This is where the word docetic comes in. Docetic comes from a Greek word, dokeo, which means to seem or to appear. There were early Christians who said that Jesus was God who only seemed to be human. He appeared to have flesh and blood, but he didn't really. It was a phantasm. And so he only seemed to be human. So that's a docetic Christology. So both the view that he's completely human but not God, and the view that he's completely God but not human, both of those lost out in the fights about what to believe. And the view that ended up winning out was a compromise position, which said, yes, he's fully human, and yes, he's fully God at the same time. And it's not that he's half human and half God. He's fully human and he's fully God. And this ended up being declared a mystery. It's declared a mystery because if you can understand it, you misunderstand it. So it's a mystery. Yeah. So in answer to your question, I don't know, until my friend Jeff Syker pointed out Salvador Dali's Last Supper, which is Salvador Dali's best painting, by the way, portrays Jesus as something, you can see through him to the Sea of Galilee. It's a terrific painting. But I don't know anything in the history of Christianity that you could identify as a docetic portrayal.
I know you said that art is not your bailiwick, but in the birth of Mary, hanging over the bed, there looks to be a green punching bag.
Yes.
Any idea what that symbolizes?
Yes, that's the medieval portrayal of a green punching bag. Yes. That is the curtain. So she's in this bedstand with this bed frame around it. That's the curtain that's pulled up. Yeah. Yeah. I had exactly that question today. I went through with Kristen, who is the art expert, and I was asking her questions because I knew I'd get some question I couldn't answer. And I said, "What's that green punching bag?" And she said, "It's the curtain." So.
Hi, in the book of John, you quoted, "It is finished."
Yes.
What are your thoughts on the argument that the original Greek is actually complete and not finished? And if so, does it matter?
The Greek word, it's telutai. It's the Greek word, the Greek verb teleao. It's where, let me see, English, you get our word teleology from. That probably doesn't help you much. So the word means both to finish something and to bring it to completion. And to say, so it is, the question is, I guess the question is, the theological one, is he simply saying, you know, it's over with now, or is he saying that all the prophecies now have been completed, have been fulfilled? And I think the Greek is ambiguous and can be interpreted both ways. It might mean both things.
I understood that Roman law prescribed crucifixion only for treason. How did the two crucified thieves end up attached to Jesus when Roman law presumably didn't permit that?
In Roman law, for one thing, there was not any kind of, it's a very good question. There was not any kind of national Roman law about crucifixion or about most things. Roman law was very good when it came to civil affairs. So there were laws about divorce and about inheritance and about selling your land and about civil affairs. There were very few laws about criminal affairs. Criminal affairs were basically given over to whoever was ruling the province, outside of Rome itself, whoever was ruling the province. So the governor of a province was given pretty much free rein. The logic was that the Romans wanted the provinces, they wanted two things from the governors in the provinces. They wanted the governor to keep the peace, and they wanted the governor to raise taxes for Rome. And whatever it took to bring about those two things, pretty much they had free rein. And so provincial governors could have anybody crucified they wanted to. Usually, you really couldn't, you weren't supposed to crucify a Roman citizen, so that was out. But if you wanted to make a display of somebody, you know, you wanted to shame them publicly and you wanted to set an example, you could have them crucified. Normally, you're right, normally it was reserved for issues of treason, but also it was reserved for the real lowlifes. And so it was not uncommon, for example, for slaves to be crucified. We have numerous accounts of slaves being crucified because they were slaves, and so you crucify them. So these two people being crucified with Jesus, we don't know what the charges were in their case. The charge for Jesus was that he was called the King of the Jews. That's a political charge of sedition against the state. You're claiming to be a king when only the Romans can appoint the king, so I mean it's a political charge. We don't know if the robbers, as they're called, were actually just low-life robbers that they decided to string up, or the word robber that is used in the Gospel of John is a word that is used by the Jewish historian Josephus. The word leistes is used by the Jewish historian Josephus to refer to Jewish guerrilla fighters, so people who are engaged in guerrilla warfare. And so John is suggesting at least that possibly that these might be people who were opposed to the government in some way.
Would you talk about the idea that probably the first stories told about Jesus were told in the Aramaic language, so that would be the first oral tradition. And then perhaps the idea that somewhere along the line, somebody who spoke Aramaic and who could write might have initiated manuscripts or scrolls that later somebody came along and translated into Greek.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The earliest stories about Jesus would have been told by his closest followers who spoke Aramaic, and eventually they got translated into Greek. It creates some interesting situations in the Greek New Testament. For one thing, I quoted this passage from Mark's Gospel, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, and then Mark says, which translated means, my God, why have you forsaken me? when the Gospel of Mark was translated into Aramaic later, based on the Greek, it's a little bit strange. It cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which translated means, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. See what I mean? Because it's put into Aramaic. The other interesting situation is that sometimes when the translation was made from Aramaic into Greek, something was lost in translation, and you can restore it by translating it back into Aramaic. So there are people who do this, on Saturday night when they've got nothing else to do. As an example, there's this famous line in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus is being upbraided for what his disciples have done, breaking the Sabbath. And Jesus tells his interlocutors that Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, when you read that in Greek or English, it doesn't make any sense. Whereas I tell my students, when they run across a therefore, they should ask, what's the therefore, therefore? So, in this case, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. It doesn't make sense. Why would Jesus be the Lord of the Sabbath just because Sabbath was made for humans and not the other way around? But if you translate it back into Aramaic, the Greek word Son of Man in Aramaic is barnashah. And so the word for Son of Man is barnashah. And so the original saying was, Sabbath was made for barnashah, not barnashah for the Sabbath. Therefore, barnashah is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now it makes sense. You see, humans have priority over the Sabbath because the Sabbath was made for them, not the other way around. So, but you're absolutely right. It's one of the problems. When you're reading something in the English words of Jesus, you're reading translations of the Greek, which are translations of the Aramaic, and something always is getting lost.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation.
I'm sorry, where are you?
I'm right up here.
Yes.
What about in either the letter of 1st or 2nd Peter, it talks about Jesus preaching to those in prison, and how does that relate to your Gospel of Nicodemus and the
Yes.
legends of how do you deal with what happened between Friday and Sunday?
Yes, thank you. I actually had my Bible here with me because I was going to quote that passage from 1 Peter, chapter 3, verse 19. Is this mic still working? Did the mic just go off? Is it working? Yeah, okay. Maybe I just went off. It's a very strange passage in 1 Peter that biblical interpreters throw up their hands trying to figure out what it means. But what it says is, Jesus was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey when God waited patiently in the days of Noah during the building of the ark. So it sounds like Jesus went in his spirit, but he went to preach to the people from the days of Noah, who were destroyed when the flood came. So biblical scholars, have a field day with this, because if you have no clue what it means, you can write a book about it. And that is, after all, how you get tenure. Right, so nobody knows what, but this idea of, but you're absolutely right. This passage is the beginning of the idea. Maybe Jesus went somewhere during those 3 days, and so he went to the spirits in prison. So that started the thinking.